All right, it's time for our weekly feature, The Political View, and there's lots to talk about with the President gearing up for his State of the Nation address on Thursday. Former President Thabo Mbeki celebrating his 77th birthday today, perhaps trying to cement his legacy with the launch of a presidential library focusing on African issues. Meanwhile, the EFF has vowed to fight on after losing another legal battle in a defamation case brought by former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel. To discuss these, we're joined by the Director of the Auwal Socio-economic Research Institute, Angelo Fick. Great to have you with us, as always, Angela. So for SONA, the State of the Nation, is there much more we can add? I think everybody across the spectrum, ordinary South Africans, experts, commentators, say this has got to be about the economy and about jobs.
Well, that's one aspect of it, but we also must never conflate the economic with the political. And it is important for us to recognize that in South Africa, not all our problems and not all of our challenges lie in the economic. There is certainly an important issue there, which is the creation of jobs and the restarting of the economy. But it is very important and actually absolutely essential for us to recognize that there are other governance challenges to which the economic solutions are not necessarily the best solutions. And to reduce all of the people who live here and their needs to the economic is, I think, to run the risk of turning us all into nothing but a labour camp for capital. And that is not, and Alain Badiou, the French philosopher, has spoken about this. It is important for us to recognize that the economic isn't the political, and that in the State of the Nation address, the President will have to address some of the political issues that are not necessarily only economic.
So what are those?
So they include things like saving and fixing our education system, securing the future of our children and their children by looking at our treatment of and custodianship over the environment. Our energy challenges are not just challenges of economic consequence, but of livelihood consequence. And then the dignity of human beings is not a secondary issue to economic opportunity, and therefore what kind of economic opportunity we create must be linked with and must actually be subservient to the notion of dignity. This idea that any job is acceptable, the idea that any kind of work is acceptable, is, I think, one that we have had in the past and that has brought us to, the crossroads in a space where we had the crime against humanity. We cannot repeat that by having employment opportunities that are actually not sustainable and that are actually deeply damaging, not just to people, but to the environment.
But I remember years ago, there was a strong focus on it won't be any job, it'll be dignified work. But that was years ago. That was talk. Unemployment has soared even higher since then.
Right, and that should not allow us into a space where we say dignity is secondary. We live in a constitutional democracy. We live in a humane arena where we are focusing constantly on the humanism of the political dispensation we live in. And we are sitting in a global situation. This is not unique to South Africa, where the political classes of the various societies increasingly are in step with the economic classes and out of step with the people that they are supposed to govern on behalf of. And in South Africa, we can ill afford to have that situation. All we need to do is to look around the world at where that has become the case and look at the instability that is consequent to conflating politics and economics and then subsuming politics to economics. There are certainly economic needs, but there are severe political issues that must be addressed by those who have been elected through the political system to govern in the name of the people.
On jobs, people are tired of words because of the situation, because there's no work, never mind dignified work. But will we hear more words? I mean, what could he do besides make new promises?
So one of the things that he did say at his inauguration and at the announcement of his cabinet was that he would put ministers onto a performance agreement. And one would want to hear what that performance agreement will be. Not necessarily in detail in the State of the Nation, but certainly some kind of indication of what the timelines for testing, what the timelines for accountability will be, and at what cost people will underperform or will perform. And this is crucial. And he's already had some of these tests with people deployed in the name of the state and in government acting outside of what was required of them. And so the test will be for Cyril Ramaphosa's government, whether or not they can act and be seen to be acting, and not just at the executive level, but at all three tiers of government where people misbehave or behave inappropriately, the test will be for the governors of South Africa, not just for the president.
Well, as an aside, Fikile Mbalula, as Transport Minister, going to the ground where 24 people died in Limpopo, we ran this story earlier, looking at that site, is that to be welcomed? That sort of
that is certainly
leadership,
important.
tokenism, but it's leadership.
I think it is important for people to, for civil servants and for public servants and for ministerial officials to go to these scenes and to, confront the pain of people who are, victimized by service delivery, structural issues, and poor management of a whole variety of things. But what I think is much more important is that people have to start acting and delivering. So, we cannot have situations where people are stuck on trains. We cannot have people, situations where people are overloaded on transport forms. There are all sorts of things that have to be. The regulation and enforcement of regulation has to happen. And that, of course, is not just the ministerial job. That is the job of all the civil servants who work in those departments to start doing their jobs and for there to be consequences when people don't do their jobs. And that, I think, is going to start at the top. We're going to be watching the president, whether he holds those in his cabinet to account, and also whether then government officials are being held to account for non-performance, non-delivery, non-appearance, or for actively undermining. Because it's not just about undoing state capture. It is about growing a new ethos of delivery, of civil service, of public service in the interest of the public and the civility and the society that we live in, rather than self-enrichment or some other form of non-delivery, which is about diverting funds, maladministration, or really not caring enough about people. We all live in this country, and so the country must work for all of us.
Should those be public, those sort of targets that ministers have to achieve? I mean, the way he's looking at this is companies that have, I think it's KPIs, key performance indicators, and you set measurable targets and dates.
So I think it's in the interest of accountability and transparency that the public should know what those ministers have to do, because that is the way in which the president's own key performance indicators, for want of a better term, will be known to us. What is it that he's using? None of this should be secret. This should all be very much in the open. The president should be able to tell us, this minister will have the following tasks, this is what he or she will be expected to do, and this is the date by which he or she will be expected to do it. That is to rebuild trust in the public, in the political system, because that trust deficit has certainly shown up, and we cannot have it continue to grow, because what signals itself as apathy or as disinterest or as non-participation will lead to greater instability. This is not to say that the parliamentary system is the, sine qua non. It is the thing that without which we cannot live. But while we have it, we must use it, and it must be used to our advantage.
What do you think of the premise that's often put forward that President Cyril Ramaphosa knows what's going on in the economy, knows how to fix it, knows what the ministers should be doing, but over the next year it's all about how he deals with his own party. So he's dealing with adversaries who can use populist rhetoric like Ace Magashule in the ANC.
I think the idea that we live in a time where history is made by men or big men or statuesque figures in the landscape is one that is so far behind us. We really need to start realizing that history is made, and the present is one of those histories, by classes of people. And so this isn't about whether or not Cyril Ramaphosa can simply, deal with his own party and its internal dynamic only. It is that. But it is also what happens in the public sector, the private sector of South Africa, what happens in the multinational global capital system, that Cyril Ramaphosa will become the conduit through which South Africa engages with the rest of the world. So this is about private investors, this is about South Africans who are here, this is about bankers, manufacturers, owners of businesses, and from the larger businesses that list on, stock exchanges to the small and medium enterprises, and how the state facilitates the people who are at the, shall we say, smaller end of the business field into getting access to some of the, shall we say, levelling out of the economy. Because economic justice is an important component of post-apartheid South Africa, given the economic injustice of colonial and apartheid South Africa. And denial of that is, I think, disingenuous of people who want to keep what they have had and what they've gained illegitimately. And there is no denying that, Merle Lipton has written about this, various other people have written about how precisely calibrated capitalism and apartheid were across the 100 years until the end of apartheid in 1994. And so we are not just going to wish that away. But at the same time, we cannot pretend that it's only the ANC and only its internal motions and contortions that account for the sort of situation that we're in. We're also sitting in a situation where this is a global phenomenon, where states and governments are increasingly disempowered and multinational corporations are very much empowered. And so in a country like South Africa, yes, the internal dynamic must be fixed, but we must also keep our eye on the very, very powerful external dynamic, which could reduce us into the penury that we think we should escape from by simply fixing the internal.
All right, so you've laid out big issues that he has to talk about. Do you expect disruptions? The EFF has focused on that Bosasa issue in the Public Protector's report, the donation to his campaign.
If that comes up, it would not be a strategy that can repeat what it used to be 5 years ago. So the disruption of the speech by a president functioned in a particular way under Jacob Zuma. It has a very different kind of consequence in the contemporary political economy, and it will become it is incumbent on the economic freedom fighters, should they wish to disrupt, or some other party wish to disrupt, to kind of play that, shall we say, gamble of deciding how South Africans are going to receive this. I think South Africans are tired of spectacular politics, and they now want to see substance and substance delivery. And that may not be, in fact, a kind of, shall we say, performance in Parliament. That may require holding the President accountable at the appropriate occasion and in the appropriate forum. And the State of the Nation address on the 20th of June may not, in fact, be that occasion best suited, because that is also the space at which South Africans get to hear what Mr. Ramaphosa lays out as the plan for his administration over the next 5 years, and particularly, having just come into office, what he sees as the major challenges that that administration has to deal with.
On the appropriate occasions, to what extent do you think this could hamper President Cyril Ramaphosa? It was very confusing when it came out. He told Parliament that he saw his a payment to his son from Bosasa. The next thing, it's something for his campaign. It's been confusing. Has it been suspicious?
Well, you know, in South Africa, anything is suspicious these days. So, you know, the question is, can Mr. Ramaphosa clearly outline how it is that money went from point A to point B to point C, how much of that he knew, and whether that tallies with what the paperwork tells us and what other people involved in this will tell us. And that, I think, can only be discussed once it happens. To prejudge the situation, knowing only what we know that is in the public domain and not having access to kind of electronic transfer records, etc., is to prejudge a situation that may or may not work out. Mr. Ramaphosa certainly should be able to clear his name if everything is above board, because he is the kind of businessman for whom records are kept. And so this would not be, and the African National Congress, should it have received that donation, would also, you know, have a sense of whether or not there should be paperwork. So this is not one that is open to only sort of, you know, preemptive speculation. This is, I think, a space in which one waits for the inquiry to finish, for the evidence to come up, and then to make a decision based on what that evidence tells us.
But couldn't he have produced that paperwork and sort of clarified this in previous months? It's dragging.
That's the question that many people will ask of him and that he has to answer. Why is it taking so long to clear his name definitively by simply releasing the public domain what it is that happened here?
Yeah. Okay, so we were talking about the EFF strategy in Parliament. What about their strategy in the courts? So let's move away from Parliament completely. The EFF saying it won't give up this fight against Trevor Manuel. He brought that defamation case. Given their public stance, do they have to continue?
Well, if they've chosen to continue, it is possibly because they see this as a lynch pin, a sort of, you know, a hook, an anchor on which to, you know, either be sunk. So they're the people who defamed the former finance minister, or the people who won a noble quixotic battle in court and overturned a finding that they found, you know, unfair against them. So it'll be interesting to see how long and how far they take this in terms of the idea of defamation. Many people have, of course, indicated that South Africa's defamation laws are terribly restrictive. And that while they're in place, they allow all sorts of people to query things, but they, to a certain extent, and I'm not saying this about the EFF statements about Mr. Manuel, but you know, the Freedom of Expression Institute has gone on record in previous years to say that government officials and public officials and people with money often have the ability to stifle voices that are critical of them by using the defamation laws. And so there is a question of freedom of speech, defamation and consequences. And we as a society might have to think very critically about how this plays out. This is not at all to say that the EFF is innocent or is the champion of freedom of speech in this case. But I think what we'll see is going on in the court cases as they play out is what balance the judiciary draws between fair political comment, freedom of speech, and maligning someone's name and reputation unfairly.
What about for the EFF itself? So it continues. Could they land up looking reckless? Is there a danger that people will get tired, that they're shooting their mouths off, saying things with absolutely no evidence?
Well, I suspect that people are a bit generally kind of concerned about politicians simply saying what they'd like to say, and not just in relation to the economic freedom fighters, but across the political spectrum. We've seen the issues around Twitter activity in the official opposition. We've seen the kinds of contradictory statements and Twitter fights between senior members of the ANC. And I think that people really, given the other challenges that we have in the society, ordinary South Africans, are demonstrably tired of the sort of, shall we say, distraction that this is from the everyday challenges that they actually face, because those challenges are real. Details of issues of proper schooling for their children, economic opportunities and life opportunities that follow from better schooling, job opportunities that follow for themselves, clean and proper housing, safer neighborhoods. We live in a country with a huge femicidal, pandemic hitting us, and we're not doing enough to deal with that, because that is also not just about fixing safety and security issues for women. It's about changing the way in which we socialize, all of us, men and women, boys and girls in the society. And those are challenges that I think people face every day. They don't have time for obsessing too much about the spats between politicians and people who at the end of the day live fairly secure lives economically with very nice salaries, good homes. And so important as questions of defamation and hate speech are, I think there are also other issues that South Africans would like us to focus on. For their politicians who are elected by them and are paid for by them, whether they are taxpayers of the income kind or taxpayers of the value-added kind, they pay these people salaries. These people should do the work.
All right, we've got about 5 minutes left, so let's look at Thabo Mbeki. We will be going live to his gala dinner tonight on his 77th birthday. He's building a library to teach young people about Africa's past, he says. Is this about firming up his legacy?
Well, I think his legacy is already established. 77-year-old people have a legacy. Former presidents of the Republic of South Africa have a legacy. And this is, I think, a kind of project that is part of who Thabo Mbeki has always been, in my view of him. Somebody posted a photograph of a poem that he wrote in 1961. One has the books that he has written, the books written about him, his letters in public. So he has always maintained this kind of building up of a record of his life in public. But also, let us not forget that he was part of the attempt in South Africa and by South Africa to reconnect with the rest of the continent through the Timbuktu project, the book in Africa, issues around preserving manuscripts that the HSRC was involved in, and Shamil Jepi at the University of Cape Town, using those So the I Am an African speech for me is one moment in a long history of Thabo Mbeki and the notion of libraries, the notion of works, the notion of the literary. And a library does not strike me as an odd thing for Thabo Mbeki to do, and seems to be the next step in his long legacy as somebody who, both as political power and as somebody who in some senses thinks of himself or presents himself or behaves like a public intellectual at some points. This is not, inordinate for me, and it seems to be a, useful moment for him to do this.
I think we spoke recently, he was very warmly received at the inauguration of Cyril Ramaphosa. Overall, what does that mean? Have South Africans forgotten about AIDS? That certainly was a huge issue. The delay in the rollout of ARVs, life and death for many. Or was it never a big issue for many? Huh?
I think for millions in some parts of South Africa, it was certainly a big issue. And I don't think it was a dismissible or negligible issue. I mean, I've taught in KwaZulu-Natal and taught the consequences, taught people who are the survivors of the pandemic. And so it is not, for me, a negligible moment. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that the 20 years of the rest of South African history have also happened. This is not to forgive or forget, but we must recognize that the man that Thabo Mbeki is now is also in a society that has done that, has done several other things since, that we must bear in mind. I'm not somebody who is a propagandist for Thabo Mbeki. I'm interested in placing the man in his historical context. And as the President of the Republic of South Africa, he does have some complicity with and implication in the pandemic that we had faced for almost a decade. Last it was 350,000 unnecessary deaths in KwaZulu-Natal in a specific period. And the consequences of that were child-headed households, were, people who were 18 and had to support their, their younger siblings in schools. So that tragedy is certainly there, and we cannot, pretend that it isn't there. It is a wound in the body politic of South Africa. But we must also remember that there was also the jobless growth, and at the same time, a kind of, almost contradictory idea that South Africa, in relation to the rest of the continent, was certainly in a better position than in the 8 years after Thabo Mbeki had left. And perhaps there is a moment now where we can take the lessons, both good and bad, from the Mandela years, from the Mbeki years, from the Zuma years, into what we're now going to think of as the Ramaphosa years, because we're a quarter of a century from the end of apartheid. And it is important for us to not either construct villains or heroes, but to look back at those classes of people who governed this society and what they were complicit with, what they had achieved, and to take the gaze on history almost unflinchingly. And some of that means recognizing that mistakes were made, and horrible mistakes, by classes of people in this country that led to horrific consequences. But at the same time also not pretend that that is the only thing that happened in those years of history. That we also had a shift in our understanding of our relationship with the rest of the continent, a shift in our understanding of who we were as South Africans, and the beginnings of a journey that we are still on away from 1994. And it is important for us to continue on that journey, looking at the past, but taking it on and recognizing it for both its positives and its shortcomings.
You've made me think of something interesting, is the fact that South Africans maybe look at people as stark heroes or villains has hampered us, even in assessing the legacy of Nelson Mandela, for example.
Precisely. And we, I think, again, have this idea, I think of a leadership as dealership. I'm not particularly interested in analyzing history from the perspective of leadership. I'm interested in analyzing history from the perspective of what happened when classes of people with power behaved in particular ways. What were the consequences? Yes, one can pin those classes on individual names, but to suggest that Nelson Mandela made South Africa sometime between 1990 and 1994, then made it again between 94 and 99, is to ignore that a whole class of people were implicated in that, and not just members of the ANC, but members of the middle classes, created a country with behaviors. Members of the working classes created the country in particular ways. Protest culture became something of a specific kind for working class people. Middle class people's relationship to protest and their responses to protest shifted between 1989 and 1997. And so those shifts for me are important because it explains what subsequently happened. This country's response to the fees must fall issue, this country's response to Marikana, this country's response to what is going on in our midst every day, right now, under the so-called New Dawn.
Well, let's end with that, because it seems to me like former President Thabo Mbeki has set himself up as a careful critic of state capture. So recently he was talking about SARS, saying if you want to bring down SARS, you can bring down the country. He's been accused of being quiet in the past. Do you think he's handling his moments to critique well?
My suspicion is that this is the kind of challenge of any senior statesman. Let us not forget it took Nelson Mandela, after his presidency, to bring AIDS back into the public domain by saying he knows somebody who died. In a period where the then president of the country said he knew no one who had died of AIDS. So in this moment, it is I think, important to hear from people who had governed before what they make of this moment. You don't have to believe them, but you can engage with them. And so Mr. Mbeki's remarks are interesting remarks, and they're remarks that we should be hearing and should be engaging. And the same with anybody who has been in a position of power, whether it's Ronnie Caswell's, whether it is LB Sachs, whether it is anybody who's been in a position, Jill Marcus. These are people to listen to think through, to think with, to think alongside, because we all have to meet these challenges that we face 25 years later together. It is all of us together or none of us at all.
All right, thank you. Fascinating as always, and we will take you live to hear from former President Thabo Mbeki a little later on at his gala dinner at his 77th birthday, also coinciding with today being 20 years since he was installed as president. That was the director of Auwal Socio-economic Research Institute, Angelo Fick. Let's take a short break.